I'd like to call this meeting to order of the Oconee County Planning Commission. This is February the 23rd at 5 o'clock. I want to make a motion before we get into the meeting here. I'd like to make a motion to change item 8 to item 9 and item 9 to item 8, to sort of reverse them.
Second.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
Aye.
Okay. Our item next item, Mr. Root, would you do application, please?
Yes, sir. Pray with me if you'd like to. Dear Father, thank you very, very much for this day, for waking us up this day, giving us awareness, hopefully self-awareness, and awareness of our neighbors. I pray that you would give us that kind of insight and awareness tonight as we do business for the county that is going to be not just applicable this evening or tomorrow, but into the future. So only with awareness that is cognizant of our neighbor's best interests more than ours can we do that well. So I pray you give the commission that kind of insight and wisdom and love, and the staff the ability to help carry into effect the desires and wishes of the commission, and that you would guide this meeting. In your name I pray. Amen.
Mr. James, would you lead us in the pledge?
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, sir. Next order of business is the approval of our minutes from the February 6th meeting. Do I hear a motion?
I move to approve the minutes.
Second.
Any corrections or misspellings? If not, all those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay.
Don't you hate it when it's perfect?
We don't have any public comment for non-agenda items. Commission member comments?
I have a couple comments.
Go ahead, ma'am.
Just on some comments regarding the comprehensive plan. Looks like plan, or checkpoint 11.1.6.4 from the comp plan was achieved, which says continue to cultivate ecotourism opportunities in key areas such as the new mountain bike facility at Stump House Tunnel, and plans expansion of county parks. So this was recently in the paper that the work on the third phase of Stump House Mountain Bike Trail is going to start. The funding was achieved thanks to Bill Whitmire, and it'll bring in another 10 miles, and there will be 20 miles completed on that bike trail. Second, comp plan 4.1.1.6, County Council approved funding for the Golden Corner Commerce Park to do grading and mow a 42-acre pad to get ready to sell and start marketing itself down there. So that happened, and that was good. And then 7312, that is upgrade and maintain county parks and rec facilities to encourage and promote ecotourism opportunities. It's an article about Phil Shirley, who is our director of parks, and it was kind of an interview on master plan and things going on. He's got 18 projects. The park system serves over 300,000 people. 60% of those are out-of-towners and 40% are locals. And the beauty of the tourism side of that is people come, enjoy Oconee County, spend their money and leave, so they don't stay, so they're not taxing the roads or schools or whatever else. But there's lots of projects going on at Shaw Ramp Park, also at High Falls and South Cove. So job well done to Mr. Shirley.
Anyone else? Okay, if not, staff?
Yep, I was asked to put together just some numbers from the year, kind of a year review for you guys. And we'll go through these. Sorry, I'm gonna go Starting with plat reviews for the year, you can see we're setting records every year. 567 reviews were completed in '22. Subdivision applications, there were 29 that came in. For residential building permits, we reviewed 1,380 site plans for residential homes. Had 23 variances and special exemptions, and had 28 buffer permits. So, everything's growing, everything's getting bigger. Code enforcement had 159 cases that opened in the year, closed 26 of them, and we ended up with 40 additionally placarded structures last year.
Could you explain that? I'm not sure.
So structures that were condemned to be placed as placarded so no one can enter them.
Okay.
So 40, were they ticketed, or what did they do with them, do you know?
They are under no trespass currently. That means that there's an open code enforcement case with the property, and there'll need to be some type of remediation done to get the placard removed.
Okay.
The screen before that, the vegetative buffer,
Yeah.
I'm familiar with what the vegetative buffer is, but what is the vegetative buffer permit?
So any development within the vegetative buffer, that 25% protected,
25 foot?
foot protected area, is allowable for 15% development. So you can put a pathway down there as long as you're not disturbing any of the trees that are over 6 inches.
And you have the permit to do that part?
There is, so there's a review to confirm that
Okay.
none of the trees are gonna be disturbed, that you're staying within that 15% developable area. Patios are also allowed, turnarounds for golf carts, all those kind of things to meet in the 804.
Gotcha.
So you're breaking records.
Every year. Yep. If there's any other questions on that, happy for those, and then we'll move on to another, multifamily student subdivision came in this week.
Oh, real quick question.
Yes, please.
The variances and special exemptions, is there a general, most of the variances are about blah, 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 or are they all over the board?
They are generally about 3 categories. So there are cell towers, which are their own category. Special exemptions, we had a couple for uses, so we had the veterinary clinic and the lake overlay, we had a boat dealership, and actually that'll be kind of towards the future. And then a lot of them were setback variances, so unique conditions for lots or topography or proximity to property lines to allow for construction.
The veterinary center, that was where the Wells Fargo is?
Yes,
Was it because it wasn't commercial to commercial, because it was
it was a change of use.
change of use? Okay.
Does anybody know, did they decide not to make the veterinary center, or as far as I know, it's not being used for that? Is that correct?
The Wells Fargo, I think, is gonna be a vet's office.
Okay, I thought maybe that plan, they changed their mind, I didn't know.
I think it's open for business.
So this is off of Shiloh Road, and I'll give you the road map in just a second as well. This is gonna be 324 units, 889 bedrooms total.
And is it considered student housing, or,
Yeah, they have told us it was student housing, so it is, that is the purpose.
It looks like a variety of homes down there, townhouses, is that right? Is that what I see?
They have 3 unit types that they're developing. They're calling one of them a cottage, one a townhouse, and one a flat.
Is there a height restriction to any of that?
There is a height restriction and control free of 65 feet.
and they're connecting into Seneca sewer?
Sewer will be through Seneca Light and Water and then ultimately through our OJRSA.
Does it have a We're open for business date?
No. Or they might, they're not required to show up.
Do we as a county have any, we talked about it on the comp plan, but is there any more headway towards looking seriously at Shiloh Road since it is a bypass and becoming even more of a bypass for Clemson University, to try to get around Clemson to get to Anderson? Obviously, that's a lot more impact, coming down that road, at least in one direction. But has there been any other talk about expansion of that or any other county support as far as trying to figure out what we're gonna do with that road?
Not that I'm aware of.
While you're on traffic, what do they plan to do to minimize traffic?
They've told DOT that they're gonna provide shuttle service every 20 minutes.
If we can get all freshmen to get in there, they don't have cars anyway for the first year. They'll have to use the shuttle.
They don't have enough parking spaces for one-to-one for every bed to have a parking spot.
How did they get away with that?
There's no parking standard in the control for district. They could have 0 parking spots if they thought they could sell them.
So there were codes for when you, building codes that says you have to have a parking space for each residence or each bed, maybe not bed, but each residence.
There's enough for each residence to have one.
But not each bedroom to have one. Are these 4-bedroom units?
They have 3 product types. I'm assuming there'll be 2, 3, and 4s.
James, do you know, what the situation down there is in terms of fire substations? I mean, are we overloading student housing to one fire station or to none, or?
Emergency management will have a review of this, so they'll be able to comment on that.
Okay.
I think Shiloh might be the closest.
They've got a lot on them as it is, do they not?
Maybe I ought to start making developers donate 2 acres for a substation when you get something like this. Yeah.
Can you go back to the county map that you've got pulled up there?
What happens when you don't have any codes to manage that?
Do we have any fear that Shiloh Road's gonna become a parking lot based on what's the pier or anything like that? Do we have any other reference point that say that parking is gonna be an issue? We don't have any expectation of that being a problem.
Isn't Shiloh Road a state road?
So it's definitely expanding.
Thank you.
Any other questions on this one?
Sorry, James, just came to mind. What about, when you look at it as far as green space, and also drainage are 2 things that come to mind, but
So they have submitted their civil plans with their stormwater and drainage plan inside there. They have submitted to DHEC for the state permit, for their stormwater permit and master grading permit already. I would assume that they will receive some comments on that plan.
just a general observation, doesn't look like a whole lot of green space.
Yeah, I don't see.
I was gonna say, the neighbors, they're the green space.
Standard to keep it from.
Is that all, sir?
That's all I have for y'all tonight. We'll move on to the
Excuse me. All right, let's move on to discussion regarding amending chapter 32 of the Oconee County Code of Ordinances by adding a provision providing for pre-approval by South Carolina Department of Transportation. We have a guest speaker, Mr. Joel Smith. I'm gonna let Tom, if you don't mind, let you speak after he does his, okay? Go ahead, sir.
Thank you all for having me. Again, so my name is Joel Smith. I'm with South Carolina Department of Transportation. I am the Assistant District Traffic Engineer for District 3, which is Oconee, Pickens, Greenville, and Spartanburg counties. I've been with the department for about a decade now. I've been in the engineering field for 15 years, spanning from Charleston to the upstate. And I'm a licensed professional engineer in the state of South Carolina. So that's just a little background on me. So I was asked to come and kind of just, I guess, have a open discussion or have just a kind of a overview of how DOT and zoning with counties, specifically Oconee, can kind of be facilitated and what we look at from an access to a state road perspective. So basically, we have a encroachment permitting process for the state, and we have that broken up into basically two major facets. We have a county level encroachment permitting office that deals with low volume driveways, which are driveways that serve 2 single-family residences or less, and then also utility permits. So water taps, sewer taps, things of that nature. All that's handled at our county level. Our district permitting does basically anything above that. So any driveways, access points that serve 3 residences or greater, we consider those commercial entrances, not commercial properties per se, because it could be a church, could be a Starbucks, could be a neighborhood. So we understand that when we call things commercial, it's not necessarily from a zoning perspective, it's from a use of driveway perspective. So typically, if it is on a state road, if they are trying to get access off of a state road, we would rely on the counties, whether, it doesn't really matter which one, but we would rely on the counties to encourage or require the property owner or the developer to come to us for an encroachment permit as early as possible in the process. Unfortunately, the way it has kind of gone historically across the state is that a developer or property owner assumes that they have to come to the county for their permits and, zoning and they understand they've got to get utilities and things like that. But South Carolina is a unique state in the fact that we own a vast majority of the roadways. Most of them are not county or locally owned. So a lot of times property owners and developers go to the county and assume that they're getting access off of a county road. And when they either get their zoning approved or they get their building permit or whatever it is that they're getting from the county or the municipality, that also gives them instant access to the road, and that's not necessarily true. So like I said, so we have an encroachment permit process. Part of that is the land use itself. So different land uses require different types of driveways, and this is where I believe this ordinance is kind of coming into play in the fact that I'll use Greenville County as an example. We've been working with them for several years now, trying to coordinate and kind of massage their requirements when somebody comes in for replatting of property. Greenville County has it split up into 3 categories. If the property is only going to be split into 2 parcels to use for residential, that's basically like a simple replatting, and they're not required to come to the DOT for that. And we're perfectly fine with that because our ARMS manual, which is our access and roadside management standards, is our guidelines for encroachments. In that manual, it very explicitly states 2 residential properties are low-volume driveways. They have to meet very minimum requirements, and it's really not a big deal for those property owners to come to us preliminarily to get kind of a review. Then the second kind of area that Greenville County has is what they call a summary plat. That's going to be 3 parcels. If a large parcel is going to be split into between 3 parcels up to 6 parcels. At that point, they are required to come to the DOT and get basically a conditional approval letter, which is typically an email nowadays, that says we've reviewed, what they're proposing. They're proposing to split this 40-acre tract of land into 4 parcels, 5 parcels for use as residences. We may comment back and say, it's in a curve of a road. The sight distance isn't that great. The speed limit on this road is 55 miles an hour. We don't want to see 5 driveways. We want to see 2 shared driveways, and maybe the 5th lot is in the straight section of a curve, so maybe they can get their own driveway. That's not the encroachment permit process, but that is our preliminary review comments that we then send back to the county for them to incorporate with whether or not they're going to allow that property to be subdivided. The third step, or the third scenario, is for Greenville County is anything 7 lots or higher. That, from Greenville County's perspective, their decision on that 7 lot cutoff basically pulls in, from what I understand, is the need for basically a public road or a private road. So they've decided, their zoning and their council have decided that 7, if you're going to take a tract of land that's one piece and they're going to split it into 7 parcels or greater, then it has to go through a very rigorous review process as if it was like a residential subdivision or an industrial park that's going to have parcels and things like that. Those also are required to come to us for a preliminary review. It's going to be the same type of preliminary review, but again, we look at it from once you go to that many parcels, and especially if it's going to be more of a neighborhood or some kind of an industrial park or mixed use kind of development, then it starts to trigger even more potential requirements from us from a state perspective. So the reasoning for that, and the reason why we feel like it's so important, is number one, the safety of the traveling public on the state's roadway network. And then number 2, for the safety of the person person or people that are actually going to use that driveway. Our number 1 complaint in the traffic office is, I don't feel safe getting out of my driveway, or I don't feel safe coming out of my neighborhood, or I don't feel safe pulling out of the Starbucks. You name it. And a lot of that is because historically our encroachment permitting really didn't have fine-tuned guidelines until around 2007. So as you can imagine, there's been a lot of development in South Carolina, leading up to 2007, when we as a state agency kind of got our act together and actually started coming up with guidelines, sight distance, driveway spacing, turn lane requirements, widths of driveways, things of that nature. So unfortunately for those people that, are running into issues and feel unsafe accessing state roads that have driveways and access points that were approved prior to 2007, there's not a lot we can do. Anything that came in after that should have had an approved encroachment permit and should have been reviewed by us and should be as safe as possible. So that's kind of a very 10,000-foot review of kind of how we do things and how we've coordinated with other counties, and quite frankly, how we really like to be able to coordinate with y'all. I've been in this position for about a year, and one of the things that we've tried to do recently is really kind of encourage those relationships with the counties and the local municipalities, whether it's the city of Walhalla or the city of Pickens or Inman and Spartanburg County, I mean, you name it. We're here to support the counties and the local municipalities and to try to work together to, you know, provide the safest roads and the safest access points, you know, for our citizens. I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. So, sure.
You've got let's say you've got a large strip of land, say it's 50 acres, and you've got a half a mile road frontage.
Okay.
Let's say, and we want to put houses in the front. How close can the driveways be?
It depends on the speed limit of the road, and then it depends on the use of the property. So, if you want to, if you don't mind, go to Google and just type in SCDOT encroachment permits. This was something I was going to show y'all anyway, so good segue. Yep, hit first link. And so this is our encroachment permit website, where we always send anybody that's got a question about encroachment permits. But if you go ahead and scroll down towards the bottom, go to the bottom right, that list of things. Second one from the top, arms manual. And if you would just do Control F for finding and type in driveway spacing. And then just go, if you would, just tab that, keep tabbing down until I say stop. It's gonna bring up a chart. And scroll down slightly. All right, so here you go. So here's an example of driveway spacing. So it's based off of posted speed limit. It's based off of the driveway usage, and then the actual ADT of the roads. That's the average daily traffic on the road. So if it's a busy road, basically 2,000 cars per day or more, the spacing has to be more. If it's 2,000 cars per day or less, the spacing has to be less. And then obviously the slower the road, the less the spacing is. So basically, to your question, if you've got a 50-acre tract of land and you want to subdivide it and build some houses on it, if the road's 30 miles an hour and it's on a 2-lane rural road, those driveways can be spaced out 75 feet or more. As if you're, Oconee County, I live over in Pickens, so Oconee County is very similar. We've got a lot of 45 and 55 mile an hour 2-lane, rural highways that don't have a lot of traffic. So a lot of times we're looking at that 225 to 275 foot spacing requirement. So it's a lot farther than your average person thinks. A lot of people think, oh, well, me and my neighbor have got, 50 foot of frontage, we can each have a driveway. Well, per that, you can't. So, yeah.
Regarding the volume of traffic on a road, does DOT keep, say, developer J down here did a road study, and on this stretch of road, do you all keep that as a library of information, or does the next developer next door have to do the same road study to determine the volume of traffic?
We share information, so the short answer is yes, they can use neighboring things. So like,
Is there a window of time that works
it's
with?
typically about a year.
Okay.
Yeah, so like if like for instance for the Shiloh road site, we received the traffic impact study for that one. We reviewed it. They had to go out and do traffic counts on Shiloh Road. We made them look at a few other intersections nearby to see how that impacted things. I reviewed that one maybe 2 months ago, I think, ish. It was around Christmas time. Let's say developer B comes in and buys the parcel next door to them and wants to do something similar. We would share that traffic study with them. We'd also make them they would have to do their own study, but they could use the data because it's fresh enough and very realistic. So
They do their own study, they can just use it to add on to that study.
And more importantly, absolutely, yes. More importantly than that, we want neighbor B to see how many new trips are getting generated by this guy. If we don't tell them about it, well, then we've not done our due diligence to share that. Like, hey, listen, there's a lot of growth coming in right through here. So
Using a road like Shiloh, curves and view lane and things like that, you mentioned 7 or more homes, obviously this is 300 and something.
Right.
7, 10, 15, 20, 50? What is a number that you would say that truly has an impact? In other words, if I'm wanting to do 8 homes or 10 homes or 20, and I spend the money on a study, where is the likelihood that you're going to come back and go, okay, no additional impact, that's no problem? Is it at 20 homes? Is it at 50 homes? Is it at 75 where you're going to go, yeah, this probably isn't going to work without doing X, Y, Z?
So, and by doing XYZ, I assume you mean like adding turn lanes or doing some kind of.
Adding where there's, I guess ultimately what I'm trying to figure out is we're going through some things and some decisions on asking a developer maybe to spend money up front.
Right, absolutely.
And
Impact fees.
to do a road study that maybe 12,000, maybe 20,000, and they do the road study, submit it to you and go, no impact.
Correct.
Is that 7 homes? Because right now we have it at 11 homes, and I'm wondering if that threshold is an incorrect threshold, that we've asked somebody to spend $20,000 for 11 homes when you're going to go, sure, you're good to go, when the real number is 50.
Yeah,
or
so,
something.
so just to kind of, to break that thought process apart, so we have a threshold for a traffic impact study, okay? So if you don't mind, same thing, do a control find and just type in, impact study. I think it should come up. I'll tell you what, just go all the way down to like one of the last pages in the manual, because I know it's an appendix at the end. Yep, keep going, keep going. Right there, land use. Okay, so this is our guidelines for types of developments, land use, and what units, so to speak, trigger that traffic impact study. So those are typically what we use as our guidelines to, like, if we get a plat in that's showing, 50 homes on a road or whatever, we'll look at that and, well, that single family home,
You're over the 45,
You're
you
over
don't
the
require
45,
the
so-
traffic study at that
yep, you
point.
just won yourself a traffic impact study.
Gotcha. So 45 units is y'all's threshold for single-family homes?
For a traffic impact study.
For an impact study?
That doesn't necessarily mean that, for instance, we've required for 10 homes that they only get one access, and they've got to have a shared driveway.
Because of a curve or speed?
Because of spacing or because of sight distance and speed. So yeah, I just want to make sure that those two things, traffic impact studies talk about mitigations from a traffic perspective, not a safety perspective. So turn lanes, signals, road widenings, things like that. The actual encroachment itself for the access point, like for instance on the Shiloh Road, they're asking for 2. If you look at that drawing, they've got them perfectly spaced out, probably within a foot of what our minimum spacing requirements are, and they've probably got them lined up exactly to where you can see in both directions safely. So yeah, so just keeping that in mind.
We also had a conversation in our last meeting trying to define some things, whether we were looking for a final permit or an application of. It sounds like that you all have words that maybe we should be incorporating your words instead of trying to put our own words in, like you're using the word preliminary review or conditional approval. Obviously, we want to meld zoning with DOT, and we're trying to do it in the most. What we're trying not to do is a developer comes in, he's wanting to do something. One, we don't want him to go do a traffic study before he even has a conversation that says, y'all think this would even work?
Right.
The second thing we don't want to do is we have a bunch of boxes that a developer does have to check before he can actually start breaking ground. And it sounds like we obviously want to make sure that they understand DOT is part of one of those boxes.
Yeah.
But sometimes a developer goes, okay, well, my big hurdle is zoning. I'm probably not going to get this approved because we're going to have to make a zoning change.
Right.
And that's where they would want to dump their money before they spent $12,000 or $20,000 on a DOT study. What is the word that we would use to say, hey, you need to have gone and talked to DOT to make sure that you're gonna be okay over here. Is that a preliminary review where they haven't started spending money, but they've come to your office and said, hey, we're gonna be going over to planning and submitting this? And you go, you look like you're gonna be okay, but just know you're gonna have to do X, Y, and Z, but they hadn't started writing checks yet.
Yeah, absolutely.
What is that wording gonna be?
So that's a preliminary review.
Okay.
Yeah, and
So if
we do that all, I mean, we literally look at hand sketches sometimes.
So if we said that we're requiring a preliminary review to be submitted with a sketch plan at county, that would be something that would work for DOT's incorporation?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
A lot of times we'll get, if you don't mind, go to the GIS map.
Could I throw something else at you?
Absolutely.
Because I think it's related to what Mike was just talking about. So we were looking at the wording, plans including 11 or more residential units.
Mhm.
You know, so now residential units becomes, is that terminology, you know, that we should use, or should we use something else? Because we weren't looking at just lots.
Yeah.
We're looking at what
Parcels.
the lots are gonna be used for.
Right.
So do we need to list single home, apartments, blah, 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 or do we just say residential?
So again, we look at it from a parcel standpoint. Because like I said, once, in our view, and the way our guidelines are written, once you go above 2 single-family residences, it kind of kicks in that, you know, we don't really care if it's a Starbucks or 5 houses. There's potentially significantly more safety impacts to having a driveway and another driveway and another driveway and another driveway. So that's why I say residential is not necessarily what we're worried about. But I also don't want to direct y'all's zoning board, you know, but does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
We work off of, we talk about subdivisions, and many people think that's a group of houses in a
Right.
cluster.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
subdivision literally is, party A, party B wants to move
Right.
the property line, and so we're struggling through some of our definitions and trying to incorporate them into your definitions.
Right.
So,
And when we hear subdivision, we don't hear neighborhood like I think your average person does. When we hear subdivision, we simply think, oh, a parcel is gonna be split into 3 or 4 or 50 or, you know, whatever. So, yeah.
But preliminary review doesn't cost anybody anything at that moment.
Our permits don't
Okay,
even cost
but they've
anybody
come to
anything.
your door.
Yep.
Okay.
They have sent us something to do a cursory review, and we will respond.
While you're on that, could you go from what the process is from preliminary review to final review and final approval?
Sure. So, we'll just kind of stay with like a 50-acre tract of land or whatever. So, property owner comes to the county, says, I've got 50 acres, I'm looking to split it into 20 parcels. You guys look at it and say, okay, well, not only is it gonna need to be rezoned because it's, you know, agriculture or whatever, and you're wanting to do a neighborhood, so you've gotta meet our requirements, but your frontage is along a state road. You need to go get feedback or have a preliminary review done by DOT. So at that point, we typically will get an email with, like I said, it could be a one-sheet civil drawing that they've already got an engineer on board that they're already kind of paying, or we've literally seen screenshots of GIS aerials with somebody's Sharpie on there that says, I want a driveway here, I want a driveway here, and I want a driveway here, and here's my lines of how I want to split the property up. We'll review that. I mean, you know, or at least we'll try to. So we'll look at that, and we'll spend 5 to 10 minutes on it and just say, you know, you're in a curve, looking at our chart, you don't meet sight distance for this driveway, but you do for these two. So you're gonna have to figure out a way to omit this driveway and get these people over to these driveways. or, you're asking for 4 driveways, they don't meet spacing, they meet site distance because you're in a straight stretch, but your driveway spacing doesn't meet, you can't have 4, you can have 3. We don't, during the preliminary review, we don't look at drainage because we typically don't know the topography. We don't have the details of sewer or water. It's really one of the, to your point, I haven't bought this property yet. I'm thinking about doing this. I don't want to spend a lot of money. Give me just is it going to be possible, or should I just move on to the next property? So that's the way we kind of look at it. So if they say, okay, well, based on your comments, I got to omit 1 driveway, I can still have 2, we got to shift them a little bit. I think the dollars still work, so I'm going to move forward. So they come to y'all, they get it rezoned or whatever they need to do. Then they start, getting their civil plans, their hydrology study done. They start submitting to DHEC. They start talking to utility providers. When that ball starts rolling is when we strongly recommend that developer or property owner to also start submitting to us. Because what DHEC may require or what the county may require may contradict what we might require from a detail perspective. So there's got to be that kind of coordination going on, because a lot of times they'll say, hey, we've got our DHEC permit, we've got our county permits, now we need our DOT permit, and we say, you're dumping 15 more CFS of water onto our road, and you're not allowed to do that. So you got to make your detention pond bigger, which means you got to lose 3 lots. So we always encourage developers to come to us as early on as possible, even after that preliminary review. Go ahead and submit the encroachment permit, submit what you have, and then as you gain more information with your civil or your surveyor or whoever it is you got, whether you got to do a traffic study or not, send that stuff to us. You don't have to have a full package to submit to us. You can piecemeal it kind of as we go.
And when we submit that application, I'm assuming there's a fee for application?
Nope.
There's no fee for application, so at that point, they've gone from preliminary review to now they've made application, but they've still not necessarily spent money until there's a final approval based on them doing traffic studies or whatever.
I mean, at that point, they're spending money on a surveyor, or they're spending money on a civil. They're at that point they're spending money. Typically, the preliminary review is their opportunity to do their due diligence before they start writing checks to their.
Perfect,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah, but once they submit the encroachment permit, typically that means that they've decided that they are gonna move forward.
Within that is the survey and the this and the that, but, okay.
Yep,
And just for clarity, that's called to submit an encroachment permit.
correct.
It's not called submit an application, is that correct?
It's the same thing. So,
Same thing?
yeah, so our encroachment permits are what they need. An approved encroachment permit is what they need in order to gain access to the state road, which is typically the driveway. Part of that encroachment permit is an application that's signed by the property owner, the civil drawings, potentially a traffic impact study, potentially a hydrology study. And all that kind of stuff really depends on, whether they're doing, 6 or 7 homes or whether they're building a Walmart. So,
This is, I'm assuming this is the stage that we've been talking about trying to define. And I just want to make sure that James has a chance to, help with some additional information if it's needed at this time. Because, to try to pair these up, he's got to agree, oh yeah, this is the time.
Mhm.
Do you see any situations, James, that
So
we
what
can
it
deal
sounds,
with?
so what it sounds like is prior to the preliminary approval, so their preliminary plat being approved, is when they need to have more than just their, conditional approval, they need to actually have an application in with DOT at that point. That's what it sounds like.
if that's what you're more comfortable with, absolutely.
Well,
Greenville County will approve rezoning and replatting with just our conditional email. Because when we do our preliminary review, we're checking the safety box, but we're not necessarily checking do you need a turn lane? Or do you need to make your pond bigger, or things like that? We're looking at it from a location access perspective. But again, I don't wanna dictate what y'all are comfortable with. I'm just saying, from a DOT standpoint, if we've looked at it preliminarily from an access standpoint, and we've given the conditional approval, 9 times out of 10, those access point locations, those driveway locations, aren't gonna change unless there's something that, like, oh crap, we didn't realize that there was a box culvert, where we wanted to put our driveway, or, oh shoot, Duke has got a power line or a gas easement that we can't cross. Like, so things can make those preliminary approvals change, but there are a lot of unforeseen circumstances that I think most developers understand that there's gonna be a little bit of a gamble. So, but again, if y'all are more comfortable waiting to see that they've at least submitted for an encroachment permit and that we've begun our official review process and not just a preliminary review, I don't wanna stop you from doing that. That's fine as well.
Mr. Chairman, if I could, James, can you pull up the last one we did, our 32-222? So, Mr. Smith, we went over this one with Ben Olson.
Olson, okay.
And
Yep.
if you could get to the text, to the change in the ordinance, James, down. So that, 32-222A10.
Yep.
So, pretty broad, generic language. It's only applicable to that portion of 123. And as I understand, the impetus for this is to get this procedure in place for all state roads, right? So really we'd just be tinkering with that little piece, 123 between, essentially Seneca and Pickens, the line to all state roads. But you see, receive approval from the DOT prior to final approval from the planning department. He was good, as I recall that conversation, it was me, you, and him, and maybe Kyle was on the phone too, James, am I correct? He's like, yeah, that's good language. We couldn't get him to different language, but I wasn't sold like he really liked that language. But to just get, like the commission's talking about, on the same page, how would you rewrite that so it's a benefit to the citizens, so they know what they're gonna get from the DOT, and they can harmonize that with what they're asking for from the county? Does that language work? Because it's like I say, it's kind of generic and broad. We're not putting in preliminary approval. We have preliminary approvals for us. You have a preliminary approval for you all, but it's still just talking about the approval. So James can say, hey, no, go back and get this before I, give your final, right?
Yeah.
So does that broad language suffice, or would you write it differently?
So, forgive my ignorance, but is 123 being used as an example?
This has been approved. This is on the books and codified
Gotcha,
now.
okay, all right. So it is specifically for 123.
Now the desire is, I understand, I don't know what the political will is, but
Yeah.
it's gonna fully happen, but
Yeah.
what we're discussing is making that applicable
Okay.
throughout the county for
Gotcha.
all state roads.
All right, so 123 is its own animal because it is controlled access. It's very similar to an interstate. So that's why that language is so strong, and
Okay.
it says final approvals, as opposed to what we're talking about preliminarily. So I don't wanna speak for Ben, but I'm very confident in the sense that US 123 being a federal primary route and has controlled access, just like I-85, just like 385, 26, what you name it, that's why that language is the way it is, and it is strong in the sense that you must receive final approval, or in order to receive final approval from Oconee County Planning, you must submit and receive approval from the DOT. Yeah, so that's why that's so strong. Once we move away from 123, it's less of a strong approval, it can be preliminarily. We would hate, I guess, we would hate for somebody to spend $50,000 on some two-lane country road that sees 30 cars a day just to get denied by the DOT after they've been approved by the county. Again, 123 is a different animal.
Right.
You know, so.
Who sets the fees for the impact study, and is there an average cost for an impact study?
We've seen, I mean, so we are not involved in the cost of impact studies.
Okay,
So most developers either have an engineer already in their back pocket that they have used previously, or, you know, they may call around to their developer buddies and say, hey, who have you used, or whatever. Generally, an impact study is gonna cost you anywhere from $8,000 to $15,000. Depends on how many counts you've gotta get, how many intersections the engineer's gotta look at, how big the development is. There's a lot of variables, but I mean, typically for a simple one, you're probably looking at $8,000. For a more complicated one, you're looking at 15, upwards of 20 maybe.
okay.
But again, that's just totally ballpark.
First of all, thank you for coming. I know
Sure.
You've got a family to go home to. This came up, I guess, kind of I guess the commission was thinking maybe of a companion piece to this 2020, what you're just looking at up there for all state roads. I guess how it's set now, DOT comes in too late in the process, so we want to make sure that DOT gets first dibs on its roads.
Yep.
They are your roads, so
Correct.
let's have you weigh in on that. There is a development in Fairplay that's been piecemealing itself off, which has raised concerns with me, because as I've driven by and looked at it, and so now we've got residential mailboxes on a 55-mile-an-hour road. Can we look at that? Do we need to look at it or whatever? So, and that's a situation where it's one at a time, and it may not draw the attention of encroachment permit office, I guess, because it's not the benchmark of 11 or up, which is what we were considering the last time we
Right.
met. Prior to that, in November, we said all state roads with no 11 or up. It was just all state roads.
Yeah.
So I guess my point is, or maybe just you, feel free to advise. I mean, I feel
Sure.
like there's state roads, you should weigh in no matter 11, 10, 9, 8, whatever.
Yeah, so again, I will still caveat with it, I can't dictate what y'all decide. We're
Correct.
two separate entities.
We're just looking for
we're
advice,
All
right.
that, so. Just to give this as an example, if you can zoom in. All right, so I did a little research on this. So Felton Road is a state road. It is 55 miles an hour? Do you know for
182
sure?
is, 182 is.
Or 182 is, okay.
Yeah, Feltman's,
well-
I think, 45. I think.
Okay, that seems about right, actually. All right, so I did a little digging through the county GIS system. At one point in time, all of those lots were owned by the same developer when it was one large tract of land. We were not privy to the subdividing of all those lots before they were approved. However, since those lots have been sold off individually over time, the new property owners, Mrs. Smith, Mrs. Brown, Mr. Jones, whoever, they've come to us for encroachment permits. They don't meet our requirements. They don't meet driveway spacing, those may meet site distance because it's in a straight stretch, but they definitely don't meet spacing. And they were clearly part of a larger common plan. So what that unfortunately forces our hand is that state law requires us as a state agency to provide reasonable access to our roads to private property owners. What reasonable access means is that if you don't meet spacing to your neighbor's driveways, or you don't meet site distance, but on the back of your property, you've got access to a dirt road, that gets you back to another state road, we can tell you, we can deny access to you where you want your driveway, and we can tell you, you have reasonable access out the back of your property. Well, you know, Mr. DOT, there's a creek back there and I'd have to buy a culvert and get across it. Well, I'm sorry, you have reasonable access to get to a state road. For these specific scenarios, there are no other access points to these driveways. Those lots touch other lots, and their only reasonable access is to get to Feltman Road. So I looked into our permit records, and we have approved permits for driveways for a handful of those lots that have been sold and are now owned by, you know, any regular old citizen just like us, that are not engineers, are not surveyors. They don't even know to look for our permitting stuff. They didn't even know it was a state road, which is not uncommon. So what we have to do is we have to approve their encroachment permits per state law. However, it is approved with an access waiver. And that access waiver clearly shows that they do not meet the minimum standards, and therefore they, as the property owner, are accepting liability. Which means that if they sell the property and whoever buys their house after them calls us and says, I can't get out of my driveway in the morning because cars are driving 45 miles an hour down this road and it's unsafe, what are you gonna do about it? I'm gonna say, I'm really sorry, but you bought a property that a driveway was put in with a waiver that the previous owner accepted liability for.
So as we've sat here and discussed this, we've discussed this as well. It's almost two different animals that we're trying to make one ordinance for. One about what we first started discussing, another about this. With this specifically, what we're finding is that the developer is doing a 1, 2, 3, 4. Have you seen other counties be able to stop that in any way or mitigate that in any way? I've always argued that if we would allow a private road to come in behind, they wouldn't have as big a right-of-way issue, they might be able to do it. Have you found anything that has helped mitigate the developer from doing this? Because obviously it's a cheap way to do business.
Oh, absolutely.
And so how do we stop that element?
So, there is no silver bullet, unfortunately. However, and I'm just gonna keep going back to Greenville because we've gone through this with them previously, and you know, we're still trying to massage the coordination and try to make it as best as it can be. They did not used to have that smaller 2-lot requirement. About 3 or 4 years ago, it was very similar to y'all. It was 7 or less, or 6 or less, 7 or greater. And we were running into this kind of piecemeal situation to where they would go to the county and get 5 lots, and then they'd hold 50 acres over here, and then 2 years later, they'd get 5 more, and so on and so forth. So we met with the county and said, hey, look, you know, they're getting smarter, you know, they're finding the loopholes. And then that's when the county incorporated, based on our our encroachment manual guidelines, 2 lots. So that doesn't, and that's why it's not a silver bullet, it still doesn't stop that developer from coming in with 2 lots now. But what we try to do is that when we see a handful of lots come in for approvals, we will the first thing we do is go to GIS. And a lot of times we'll see those 2 lots come in or 3 lots come in before a county has approved the subdivision of the rest of the lots. Well, at that point, we'll throw up the flag and say, hey, Mr. So-and-so, we're not going to tell the county that we're okay with this because we can see that you own the 50 acres next door. What, you need to come to us in the county with your plan. What's your master plan?
So if we used a word like preliminary approval, even if it was just for two, the developer, yes, we want to catch, but what we don't want to do is the grandmother who has just given some land to her grandchild and said,
Right.
okay, here, section off this. Grandchild still needs to come get that permit from you because he may find that it's in a turn or that the speed limit doesn't work right or whatever. And you're going to say, hey, you need to go tell your grandmother you need 20 extra feet.
Yep.
All that sounds great, but we don't want the grandmother or the grandson spending a road study if that's what they're really trying to do. If we use the word preliminary review, would it at least help that person get by, and would it help you catch or potentially catch the developer who's trying to do this?
Yeah, it would, and we have run into that exact same scenario where we've got family, trying to coordinate to where, grandma, grandpa's got the land, they're giving it to the grandkids and this, that, and the other. And we're more than happy to work with them, and that doesn't trigger those big-time civil engineer costs, those traffic impact study costs. If we can, that kind of goes back to that napkin sketch. If they can show us, what their plan is, at the end of the day, and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, at the end of the day, all they're gonna ultimately be required from y'all, from a county perspective, they're gonna have to get a survey done in order to get that platted. So we can take that survey as good faith to say, here's the 50-acre survey, here's how it's being split up. We can trust this citizen that they're not trying to pull the wool over all of our eyes and do it that way.
So preliminary review is an important word that we probably need to be familiar with.
So in the case of modifying this paragraph to be more general, would we say something like properties with road frontage on state roads in Oconee County submit a preliminary approval or receive a preliminary approval from the SCDOT prior to something from the county, final approval, or prior to what would we say for the
And is
county?
the word approval, or is it preliminary review email, letter,
So we like to use the word conditional approval.
conditional?
Yeah,
So
because
preliminary review, conditional approval doesn't require the grandson to have spent money at the moment. It's
Right.
just.
Yep.
Okay. So then what would the county piece say prior to what for the county? Final approval or prior to?
I mean, it's gonna be preliminary approval or final approval. With that preliminary approval, that's what allows them to start breaking ground and actually moving dirt.
But that's their preliminary,
No, so
Oh,
we also have.
okay, I got
Preliminary
you.
approval from the county allows them to start
Okay.
doing their infrastructure work. Or final approval, which is what allows them to start selling the lots that they're subdividing,
So if it's gonna be conditional, you want it before preliminary?
I think.
I would think so.
I got a question, Mr. Root. We had this up here, section 32-222. Is this just for a short distance of 123? This is not for the entire highway, is
This
it?
is the one that was adopted by
I
council.
mean,
This is
just
between
for that-
It's not a
Seneca
draft, y'all pass
That's
this
what,
on to council.
this is for
It's been
this is
approved.
for just that short section of 123, correct?
It's relatively
Seneca
short.
city limit
not
to
for the
the
entire-
county line?
Right, exactly. Seneca to Pickens line.
So it's not from the city limit sign in Seneca there, all the way to Georgia.
No, it doesn't go that
No.
way.
All the way to Clemson.
So, I mean, to me, it's sort of misleading, but if we're gonna make it, you have different rules on 123, whether it's in Westminster or wherever. This only applies to that little short section, our ordinance. So would we have to change this in the ordinance to make sure that 123 follow the rules they're supposed to? Everybody else has to follow the way we want it done?
I think that's what we're talking about. I think that's why we're here, is to, this was a test case, as I understood it, coming from the planning commission 6-8 months ago. To county council approved it based on y'all's recommendation. And Mr. Elliott at the time said, hey, perhaps in the new year, yeah, it was right at the end of the year, so it wasn't that long ago. In the new year, we can talk about spreading this around to the other primary corridors. He hadn't brought that back up, and then James said, back in November, y'all talked about applying it to all state roads. And so I was like, well, let's get it on this agenda. We can talk about it coming to all state roads. It's consistent with probably where council's thinking, or at least what they would want to consider, if y'all are considering it. So that's the notion. It's just spreading this out so we get on the same page with the DOT. It's a service to the citizens, it's a service to DOT, it's a service to the county planning department, and it harmonizes everybody. So it's just a matter of getting the right wording so we blossom this just from this one section 123 to all state roads. And it may be that we have to chop it up to get it for the different types of roads, that would be best, or it may be that we just tie it to conditional approval and preliminary approval on the county end.
Do you have a question?
Go ahead.
Going back to your statement, you said that they can start working on their infrastructure when they get preliminary county approval.
Yep.
Do they get preliminary county approval if they still have other boxes unchecked?
No.
So in other words, would have had to go through zoning, they would have had to go through variance changes and things like that?
Yeah, so, I mean, the zoning thing's not really it's never come up since I've been here. But yes, there.
But it has as far as right-of-ways and stuff like that, changes, BZA changes.
Sure, yeah, if there's a variance.
So those boxes get checked before they actually start moving dirt?
Yes,
Okay, so it's not like we have a fear of them coming in and moving dirt until they've actually done all the things that they have to do, from your standpoint, with the exception of DOT.
correct.
So as long as we address DOT, we're in line with everything else already.
And to that point, we regularly approve temporary drives for that purpose. Because a lot of times they gotta come in and clear trees and do the preliminary, and they may not have a signed set of civil plans, but they wanna move dirt. So we'll give them what's called a temporary construction entrance just for that. But that doesn't guarantee that they're gonna get, a driveway where they want it, so.
To Mr. Root's point and to Joel's point here, this current wording is very harsh, for not using the word that they used, but because it was dealing with a road like 123, which is similar to 85. I don't want us to make a one-size-fits-all category, but I do like the idea of using the same words of preliminary review, conditional approval letter. We save the grandmother from having to do expenses. We create something that does require this communication to happen. It also sounds like it allows the developer to say, BZA is my biggest hurdle, zoning might be my biggest hurdle, before I spend money on a road study. But I've still talked to everybody to make sure that I can even access the road by using the word preliminary review, conditional approval letter. Is that right?
Drop the word letter.
Okay.
Only because we send
Preliminary review,
emails
conditional
nowadays.
approval.
I don't wanna
Sounds
have
like
to
that's
sign a
magic
letter.
phrase, and whatever we do.
I think the best way, in my mind, to do it would be for y'all to make a motion to direct the planning director and the county attorney to work with Department of Transportation, Mr. Smith, to come up with language to apply to all state roads and DOT approval, working on the process, so it applies appropriately to all state roads, and bringing that back to the planning commission for consideration.
And,
So move.
okay.
I made
Well,
that
just a
motion.
second, I'd like to move that we create a motion on what Mr. Root just said.
Yes. And you're gonna,
Can we get a second?
I'll second that. And then discussion. Does staff and Mr. Root understand that our objective, or at least my thought about the objective is that when we are dealing with a development, we want to, A, protect the small family and don't want them to have big expenses. Two, that we want the developer to be able to spend the money where they think their biggest hurdles are, whether that's in the BZA or whether that's in a zoning change, prior to if a road study is going to be issued, that they check whatever box they need, as long as they've gone and talked to DOT, and DOT says from an access point, we don't have an issue. My understanding with staff is that the problem comes is that they approve something, then the access changes, and that would have potentially changed the way they approved.
Yeah, no, I understand. I think it's been a good conversation.
Wait, Dave.
Simpler question. So, Mr. Smith wants to go, build a lot, or have a parcel on Highway 123 between Westminster and Georgia line. Will this new write-up saying state roads apply to that individual?
I think that's, my thinking is, and when we sit down, pen to paper, and put there, I've got more theoretical in my mind, because I don't deal with the people that they deal with on a daily basis and all the exact issues. But my thinking is that we may end up with categories of roadways similar to how the DOT parses them up. So you'll have a process for your primary roadways, like 123, and a slightly easier process for the two
We
roadways.
discussed that we didn't want as harsh a wording for between Seneca City line, or Seneca municipality and Pickens County line because of the heavy traffic and development there versus 123 going back towards Georgia,
Where it's less popular.
west of Westminster, where there's hardly anything. So I guess my question was, if we create this new paragraph, will it apply? We know the current paragraph won't apply because we intentionally discussed that and said it wouldn't, and decided that it wouldn't. So this new paragraph, will it apply? Or will you have to massage some wording or another paragraph to apply to that section, because it's not a state road, it's a federal highway, correct? Is
Well,
that-
it still comes in as a
Still
state
state road.
road.
State road,
Yeah.
So it seems to me like you could make it work.
It just receives federal funding.
The federal government has been good about essentially devolving their roads into the state.
Yeah, they don't-
Unlike the state, they've been wanting to
They-
give
they
it
don't-
to
they
the
don't-
county,
they
but
don't
we
want
we
roads.
haven't been taking much.
Federal
But,
government doesn't want that stuff.
But yes, to your point, yeah, we want to cover those appropriately, and I think that's probably the best way to do it, is just to sit down, so then we'll come back to y'all, and yeah, this hits the mark, and this doesn't, and then we can just, from there, take it, if y'all so move, to council.
All right.
One last comment on that is the present ordinance that's already on the books. If there's a way for us to keep that and just in this other ordinance, make mention of excluding that ordinance, this one that we already have, does that make sense?
It does make sense, and we'll just have to see when we land on the final language. I don't know that it would be, I think what we'd want to do, like I say, is just embellish that, just expand that paragraph. Massage it some and expand it some, so we hit each category of road and the nature of the applicant, so we hit it right.
Okay,
So I don't know that we'd have this one section, on an island.
addendum to the ordinance.
In essence, yeah, and as it's codified, we won't read it as if they're all done at the same time. I mean, that'd be the goal.
Okay. Thank you.
All right, any further discussion? All those in favor? Opposed? Okay.
Thank
y'all.
you.
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
A lot.
Okay. Our next item is,
So you're not gonna let me talk?
yes, I am gonna let you talk.
Good night.
Sorry, Tom.
Since you've already acted on it, I don't know what difference it
Well-
makes, but,
It's not final acted, we've just
oh,
getting
that wasn't a
it
vote?
lined up.
I thought that was a vote. Anyway, I had never objected to, the concept of, a developer needing to do his due diligence before he proceeds too far. That's just smart business. Most developers would never object to that. And, but one of my issues with the particular wording of this, section of code is that it says properties with road frontage on US Highway 123, and it doesn't matter even if it changes to all state roads. Between the, it's with the road frontage. Now, that's making an assumption that you're wanting an encroachment permit for 123 or whatever state road. You may have access to another road that doesn't involve that. It should really be more about what road you're trying to encroach on. Because why go through all this stuff with the state? Because if you're gonna encroach on a county road, it has nothing to do with the state roads. It has nothing to do with 123. I went back and looked at a bunch of the property on 123, and there's plenty of ways that it has frontage on 123. But no developer in their right mind would try to access 123 because it's gonna be so expensive to build a bridge or do whatever, and they got another road they can access that may be a state road, or it may have just been a county road, but there's other access. And so that's what doesn't make sense to me here, is one of the primary things. The whole idea of sharing, connecting parking lots, that's a whole different issue, because that's a private matter. Those are, deals with reciprocal parking agreements and reciprocal egress. And that comes in another whole section of DOT. I know because I have an interest in some property down in Columbia, and we're right on a corner, and it's 2 state roads. But our building, in order to have enough parking spaces, we had to have 2 egresses. And so we made an arrangement to have an egress, a shared egress with another property owner, and we have a reciprocal parking agreement, reciprocal egresses, and that's what allows us to do what we do. But these are private matters. This is something that was in our best interest to do, and we sought to do it. Saying that, somebody should have to have connecting parking lots, those are private. I don't see how the county's got any business in that whatsoever. But my biggest issue with this is saying that if somebody's got property that fronts on a state road, even if they're gonna encroach on a county road, why should they have to go? I don't understand that at all. Doesn't make sense. Thank you.
Thank you.
So we might need to be, if there is an encroachment that's gonna be sought after by that recipient, that if DOT approvals are gonna be necessary, then that preliminary should be submitted. But if they're not even gonna be going onto that road, then
I'm sure the DOT would approve then that we do not need to give you an
does
encroachment.
DOT, then that becomes the question is, does DOT approve them or do they ignore them?
They would just say it's not applicable.
Right,
We
and
have
that's
no-
why I guess we
have no
wanna make
interest in
sure
the
that
road.
we don't wanna be going, well, you don't have the DOT, and the DOT won't respond to me because it's not applicable.
Right, yeah, no, we can address the language and then tighten that up.
Okay. Our next item is a junkyard, the draft junkyard ordinance revision. I will turn it over to Mr. Root.
First, apologize, having watched that last commission meeting where I was here going through this twice. It was long. So I'm sorry, but we did it. We were thorough, I think, and we're not gonna take as much time, or I'm not, for my part, gonna take as much time tonight. Y'all got a copy of the red line, promised red line edition there. I got to the point where I didn't redline all of the grammatical, typographical changes that I might make. I really only did the substantive ones, so there will be, when the final clean version comes back to you, there'll be a couple more caps or italicized words that are defined words. It's gonna be a little bit cleaner. So it's not, obviously it's a red line version, so it's not final, but it's not a, dress version either. I didn't want, just because everything changed is red line, there's just become to be too much red. So, we're just gonna flow down from the top if that suits y'all. The, only changes made and I did the numbering consistent with, which I thought was a good idea, Article 10, Section 32-751. I just did those numbers. That's not anything in stone, but as far as section numbers, I added those. Those are not redlined. 32-751, really only clerical changes, a little bit about, some substantive language regarding attracting and harboring mosquitoes, et cetera, but I didn't take away or change any of the intent of the findings that y'all had given. So, bring the clean version back. I know there were some, I don't know if y'all were all on the same page as far as the last finding. When you get the clean version, you can vote and say, let's kick that out or keep it. The 32,752, I think it does fit for chapter 32. When we had that, this is all as discussed, we had the discussion about development standards ordinance versus the unified performance standards. This the red line language addresses that cleanup.
Mr. Root,
Yes, sir.
so nowhere in here do we use the word junkyard by itself anymore, correct?
Correct. If it is, it's one of those first categories of things that I have not cleaned up. It's commercial junkyard, should be all with the capital C and italicized. Once you get to the definitions, italicized commercial junkyard. Yes, sir. So then B is the authority, and this is really pulled out of the code, almost word for word, as I use with most of the ordinances. And then we get to the definitions, which is probably the most substantive part. We talked about a way to clean it up. We had a couple different definitions of junk and junkyard and commercial. So I tried to harmonize that. So we have commercial junkyard, which is essentially someone who is in the business of storing, hauling, selling junk. Junk's defined right below. It has the exception that y'all carved out. And then I define junk as a combination of the definition that you all had. I think y'all had two essentially, but it's junk consistent with the State Junkyard Act. And I think most of what you had in there otherwise was from Greenville. So when we have the definition of junk, it's a harmonization of those two. So that's really as far as identifying these enterprises. It's a commercial junkyard, it's in the business, storing, handling, selling junk. Junk is what's defined below. So I think that simplified it and is consistent with what we talked about and just addressed those kind of enterprises that y'all wanted to address, I believe. So if not, tell me so we can tinker with it some more.
Those look good.
Good,
I say
okay.
in between those is the definition of fence, and we had we go down to the vegetation issue, but we had, I know, some discussion about the fence and about it being aesthetically pleasing or whatever, things that are more subjective. I put in what I think is a substantive change, fence constructed in a commercially appropriate and sound manner, and then you have the same extension, no less than 6 feet. So, as a term of art within the legal profession, commercial best efforts, these things do have meaning. So it just means you're a business enterprise, you're going to use commercially reasonable efforts to put this fence up. So yes, someone is going to have to say, that's not a commercially reasonable effort to put a fence up, but and I don't mean this in a negative way, like pornography is defined, or you know it when you see it in a legal context. So how it first was categorized as obscene, you kind of know it when you see it. And that's the way, as far as hitting what the nature of the fence, what it needs to look like, this, I believe, is better than aesthetically constructed. If y'all have a different idea.
What does sound manner mean?
And to me, again, sound has a term of art meaning is that it is, I won't use sound in the definition, but it is something that's not going to fall apart.
So is this common terminology?
Yes.
So people will know what it
Yes,
means?
I think everybody, Tom built something that he would think that it would be sound. It's not going to fall apart, it's not
Okay.
going to prematurely deteriorate, it's sound. All right. So then I did make some slight changes as to the major and minor local streets. I know it comes in only one time, but it's important because as to the commercial junkyards that are going to be created after the enactment of this ordinance, you're only allowing them on major streets, major local streets. So we had the one that had traffic counts involved with it. We talked about, let's strike that and let's just keep the definition anchored to what y'all had first delineated within the ordinance, and that's what we have here. So I played with the wording some, try to tighten it up to what I believe captured the essence of our conversation and your intent. But if not, do say change it.
That's good.
I mean, good, no objections, thoughts? All right, I'm just gonna keep on plodding down. If y'all have something you want to change, obviously this is gonna come back in a black version, clean version. It's not gonna go to council just from here. I want y'all to see it one more time before it goes, and for you to have your actual vote on that final document. So if you have one more chance that you look at, you're gonna have one more chance to look at it. If you have objections, then you can certainly do that. But I want to catch it as much as we can now. All right, so non-residential I struck, it's not used, wasn't used as a term anywhere else in the document, so I just struck it. I don't recall now, even in going back and looking at the video, that we talked about non-residential. But I think that was part of a notion at some point in this process with you all of tying it into major local streets and minor local streets, that you wanted to hit these places being non-residential type areas. But it wasn't necessary to have it as a defined term. Public building, just kind of tweaked the language again. That's more of a ministerial work on that, nothing substantive. Reinspection fees. So we don't have this used elsewhere as defined, but I didn't just strike it because I'm assuming this might be something that you want, council approves all fees in the budget, so we can't just come up with a new fee. Planning department cannot. There's a process that has to be gone through during the budgetary process to implement fees. If we're gonna have a reinspection fee, it's good to have it defined, but it's not used elsewhere, so. Was there, at a time, the notion was, you were gonna have it in the ordinance, I'm assuming.
I move we strike it.
Second.
All in favor?
All right, so right of way. This one I did do some substantive changing on. I think primarily, one, to give what I think is a good legal capturing of, the limits of a public road, the full property interest or easement area thereof. So whenever you have a deeded right-of-way or an easement that's covering the right-of-way, you're gonna have the easement premises defined, even if they're not called that. It's essentially what the easement applies to. So that's gonna be what governs the nature of the right-of-way, excuse me, for deeded right-of-ways. And then for a prescriptive easement, which is what I talked about before, I think we spent some time talking about this, I came up with language that just tied it to the area that is used for travel, maintenance, and support.
I did have one question there, and you may have covered it, and I may not, I'm not an attorney on this. You've got right-of-way shall denote limits of a public road, and then you talked about on county roads where there's no deeded right-of-way, and you described that. I'm envisioning some of these private gravel roads that may access X number of properties, and we're later gonna be talking about that the fence has to be out of the right-of-way. But should we say limits of public road and private road?
You certainly can, yes. I mean, however.
In other words, could an attorney come and argue, well, you don't say anything about private roads here, so we don't have to follow the right-of-ways that exist that may, does that make sense?
It does make sense, and I guess in my mind, this was gonna be, we were thinking about having these on major local streets, and this ties into the setback.
And that may be where it's caught, is that it's gotta have two access points. But I'm just thinking, okay, you've got some of these still old gravel county roads, and somebody's got 25 cars, and all of a sudden he says, well, hey, I might wanna just go ahead and commercialize this thing, and now his neighbors are going, wait a second, you can't go right up against the road.
For both, I think it's not gonna do any harm, probably, to put in private roads. I don't think it'll pop up the way it's the whole ordinance is structured now, but if it does, in the situation like you're referencing, it wouldn't hurt to have it in there. And when you're talking about the gravel county roads, those are the roads that are usually ones that the county has, gotten its interest, so to speak, by prescriptive use over the course of 20 years. And that is, the county calls ditch to ditch. So that's the traveling surface and the area that's necessary to maintain the road. So when they scrape the road, re-gravel it, and mow it, and the drainage ditches that are necessary or are pertinent to it, that's all that area. And that's what the county considers its prescriptive easement. This gets challenged in the court. That's what the area that the courts have upheld as being the prescriptive easement. Public bodies, private roads can have prescriptive easements on them too.
And if they do, then it may mean that it's already just accessing that one person's property. But I was just noted, since you did say county roads and you did define public roads, that could somebody argue that private was left out and therefore it's not applicable? So that was my only question.
Like I said, I don't have any heartburn on putting it in. Alright. So the setback area we talked about, this minimum distance as established in this article between a fence. So this starts to get into the language or the discussion we had between where is the business going to be done. And it was a little bit murky, but I think the essence of our conversation was that you wanted the fence to be what captured the junk, the fence to be what is set back from the roadway or the waterway, and all the business to be done inside the fence that relates to the storing, handling, etc. of the junk, including unloading of the junk. But if you're doing ancillary business, that's, if it's transferring money, if it's just meeting somebody out there saying, hey, what do you got in the back of your truck, that can happen in between the setback, I'll call it setback area, in between the fence and the road or the waterway. Correct? So I scrubbed all the language for relating to vegetation as we talked about before. And then we get into the next section right away. It shows how I tried to handle that.
What does conceal mean? Legal terms?
Same thing as hidden, I just like the word better.
I'm just trying to figure
But
out, how do you completely conceal stuff, especially in seasonal, particularly in the winter?
So I think the commercially reasonable efforts is where you have, again, some margin. I don't think so whenever you say best efforts or commercially reasonable efforts, it's known that it's not gonna be perfect, that you cannot.
Okay, commercially
completely do-
reasonable is the key verbiage
Yes,
here.
right.
All right.
It's essentially, I have done my best as a business to do this. It's not, I can't think of the right term right now to employ, but as a business, I have made my best efforts to screen this property with a fence and along with the adjacent vegetation, to talk to Mr. Johnson's point, that's either existing or planted for these purposes. So this gets away from that notion that you're, clear cutting to put in, some smaller shrubs.
To both of y'all's points, down in the hole, below grade, roads there's no way you can make a 75-foot fence to not see down in that hole. So commercially reasonable effort.
Yeah, I like that word.
So the one point I noted here is a comment. Consider scrap metal dealers and height of stacking. I just wanted you all to consider that. Greenville had an exception in their ordinance as to the fencing area for scrap metal dealers, and I was curious why it was. And they've got a wonderful database, because I was just Googling through their ordinances, and they had back in '77 the actual motion that came up as to why they accepted the scrap metal dealers out of this fencing requirement. And it was because at that point in time, and I'm sure it's still an issue, I just wanted y'all to consider it. You know, there is that stacking element, you know, there's not always gonna be, for certain types of operations, that is something that can be below 6 feet or really easily screened because they stack. So I'm not saying that you have to do anything, you can keep it just as it is, those folks have to screen it, but I just wanted to toss that out there. I don't know if that's been a problem, why this all came about, because, you know, somebody has a commercial junkyard that's got cars or whatever, 30 feet in the air, but didn't know if you wanted to consider it differently. I'll take the silence as a no.
Are you saying put a height limit?
No, I'm not saying put a height limit. I'm just saying that Greenville had accepted it. And it was back in the 70s, it was a different time, but they were making an effort to accommodate that type of business.
Okay.
So, hey, we know that your operation, by its very nature, is gonna require you to stack vehicles. We're not gonna require you to have a 30-foot fence, or the same kind of efforts are not gonna be made. I didn't change the language to accommodate that. Language is essentially as we discussed it. I just put that comment in there if you wanted to consider it.
So that would add flexibility for a junk car business to stack cars.
I think that's a consideration, yes. I mean, that's what Greenville's idea was.
Make a motion that we add something to give them that relief for stacking cars. The language, you would come up with the verbiage.
Second.
Call for the vote.
Any discussion? All those in favor?
That's fine.
Opposed?
It's probably gonna be language along the lines of appropriate to the nature of the enterprise, so something kind of soft and broad. Okay, that will cover that kind of operation, give them some more leeway, but there may be other operations that need that too. Y'all want to tweak it some more after having thought about it? We can do that, but that's probably.
Should you, or could you also put in there something about, the safety aspect of it? I mean, somebody stacks something 15 high and it's down a windy corridor, now is that something that should be applicable or not, since safety is one of the big components of why we started this process?
I don't know that we want to get into, once we've crossed that line of how they're gonna operate safely within,
Okay.
in the fence. then
So if the
we're- then
15
we're in.
cars, 10 of them fall over the front of the fence, that's on them, period.
Tornado takes a couple and throws them up against. the house.
Period, and that's why I'm thinking more generic language appropriate to the operation as to the fencing and concealing requirements. I don't necessarily want to step inside the fence and say how they need to do it. A lot of it's gonna be, in many cases, it's gonna be already defined, by DHEC requirements.
I think wasn't wanting to find safety, I was just saying, with a reminder to them to keep safety into consideration. If there is a house 10 feet off of there and they stack something 25 feet high, that if it did fall, it's gonna fall down on there, just like you can say, that tree right there, if it blows my way, it's gonna hit my house. That was my only question about it.
Or loose scrap could fly.
Fly,
Also.
just pile it up in the middle, if it blows, it's blowing 30 feet, I had no expectation that it could blow 200 feet into that guy's window.
Yeah, there's an industry standard that these operations will follow, so it'd probably be language then, considering that, appropriate to the reasonable, customary and safe operation of that type of enterprise.
Yeah, I don't want you to go into too much detail, I just want there to be, if we're saying you can stack them high, a reasonable effort, like I said, I can tell if my neighbor's tree is gonna hit my house if the wind blows a certain way.
Yeah,
I would think the same would apply if you stacked something so high and so close to the property line.
I got it.
Maybe something like consider, neighboring property owners or something like that.
All right.
Our job is to make up stuff, his job is to fix it.
All right, so then we're down to the actual setbacks. So I added as far as the setback from, state roads that is subject to, we've talked about preemption before, when you have a state law that's gonna, trump a local law in this regard. The state law has, a junkyard act that's applicable to highways, cannot be within 1,000 feet of them unless you're screened. They've got those provisions. We're not going to be able to make less stringent provisions. And so I just accomplished that tip of the hat to the State Junkyard Control Act in item number 1.
Good.
So then I do have a question here, though, 250 feet from all rights of way. We talked about this before. I don't think we ever landed on exactly how we want to do it. My notion was it should be from the edge of the right of way. The edge of the right of way is not going to be the edge of the pavement always. We talked about how it could be way up in the middle of their yard and they don't know it until the state comes in and decides to widen the road. But in my mind, that should be the measuring point. Is for their good. It's for everybody's good. In that regard, that's the way the state notes the setback for the 1,000 feet from the edge of the right of way.
I think they'll do it that way.
Similarly, on number 4, so the bodies of water we talked about, we had a lengthy discussion about waterways and which ones we're going to trigger. I just went with essentially the DHEC definition. There's case law that surrounds it, but again, it's for different purposes than what we're dealing with here. We're dealing with more of a common sense. It is for environmental concerns, but it's more of a common sense. This is a body of water. And these are the types, but where do you want to measure it from?
Deepest point.
I mean, you couldn't really say full pond elevations because a river doesn't have a full pond elevation.
Right, and that's where my mind first went, because we measure stuff on the lakes. It's easy enough, but
Does the state law have this in there?
no, we just had this terminology. Yeah, it didn't have.
So how are you gonna do it?
On the edge?
There is, I forget the terminology, but there's an average, what is it, average water height.
Does
It's not
DOT
full pond
have something,
level.
I'm sorry, does DHEC have something for non-navigable waters?
I don't think so.
As far as their setbacks?
I don't think so. In what context?
Well, I'm just wondering, DHEC has certain setbacks from creeks and streams and non-navigable waters as far as chicken houses or buffers or things like that. They've got to
How
measure
they
from
measure
somewhere.
from, yeah. Let me check to see what their wording was, because I didn't, when I came to this language on just really kind of defining bodies of water, what they include, I went with that, and then I came back later, and I was like, well, how are we gonna measure that? So those are in 2 different sessions, so let me go back and see if I can come up with the state has a way they measure it, well, I'll write that in.
And DHEC may already have something about junkyards as far as from waters, pollutable waters or something like that. And if they do, they've got to measure it from somewhere.
I don't think you're gonna be able to find anything.
And if not, we make it up.
I don't see any way of measuring it from a particular place, the way we've got it listed.
Well, and creeks change.
I think you measure it from the current edge of water, unless it's a 20-year flood stage or a 10-year flood. I mean, you want to measure it from where it is.
The problem is the
At any
well,
given, even if it's raining.
Mr. Nix, the problem is it's also included wells.
Oh, how do you measure the well?
which I think is something that should be included.
Which brings up a good point about the flood stage. I'm guessing that somewhere in the state law it says you can't put a junkyard down in a flood zone.
Yeah,
Okay.
I'm assuming too.
Okay.
I haven't read it, but I would imagine citizens can't do much else.
Number
So let
5,
me see what I can find. Let me go back on that one and see if I can find a definition so we're not reinventing the wheel. Mr. Pearson?
Wells wasn't in there, you could use something, related to full pond, level of water from the edge of full
That-
pond.
That's the only outlier.
If you, I don't see any way of keeping wells in there if you do that unless you put except for wells.
Or you could just put, or from well center line.
Yeah, you could do something like that.
All right, let me see what I find.
Wait for the regulators to go out and determine if there's a violation or not.
And then I just note if more than one setback applies, the greater distance is the one that's gonna be enforced. I mean, that's pretty common. Any objections? All right, so then at the bottom, commercial junkyard shall, and this is back to the major and minor streets located on major local streets. I think I just moved this from another area. Prohibited on minor local streets. All right, so over to the next page, 507, all junk shall be stored within.
I got a
Yes, sir.
question on, why are commercial junkyards prohibited from being accessing a minor local street? What's the rationale for that?
That's, I don't know, that's the one, I got that one. I worked with what I had with y'all drafted. I'm assuming you wanted it to be in more, going back to the non-residential, you wanted it to be in the more heavily trafficked, commercial-ish nature. I'm assuming that's what was meant to be captured, but I didn't create that one.
So can you assume minor local street is mostly residential or refers to residential areas?
That's the way it's
That's-
defined, yeah.
Okay.
And to go down that road, we don't define that anywhere else in our roads and bridges side, do we? As far as the definition of minor and major?
We did, that's where y'all had both definitions in before, and one was based on, there were very different purposes, one's for subdivision requirements and how wide the road's gonna be, and it was based on average daily trips. And then, so this one is different, and this is the nature where you're gonna allow the siting of it. And you wanted the siting, and it's essentially, I guess, the goal is to hit, 'cause like I say, more of a commercial, industrial area.
Okay.
I don't know that it's a bad way to do it. I mean, it is a way to do it. Probably different ways to do it.
People can still ask for a variance, is that is that true?
Sure.
Okay.
There's most things you can get a variance from. There are some things certainly, obviously, you could not. But a area variance is what that would be. And it would be something you could request.
Maybe an argument for later.
All right, so back over to page 507, item E, all junk should be stored within, this is what we were talking about before. So getting the junk within the fenced area of the junkyard, the setback area, being the area that, between the required fence and the roadway, waterway, property line, et cetera, shall be maintained in a clean manner, should not be used for storing, loading, or unloading junk. So that leaves the other operations to be, and they're permissible within that setback area. In between the fence and the property line or roadway, what have you. Can do other business, can't unload, can't load junk, can't store, handle the junk, that all
But
has
you
to
can
have
sell
behind the
junk in
fence.
that area? If you're
As
saying you
far
can
as
sell
the
it here?
exchange, the commerce part of it,
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, that's, I didn't write that out of there. Again, but that's why I took the 2 hours, because I didn't want this to be my ordinance. I want this to be y'all's. So if you had a different way you wanted to do it, if you wanted to have no business activities outside of the fenced area, then that can be a way to approach it.
No, some places have their office here or their building here, and then the fence starts at the back of the building. So if we did something like that, we'd be saying, no, you gotta go all the way to the back of your building before you can do business. You can't do anything in the front. So I think we need to leave it like it's, the way it's written, it's pretty
I
good.
would agree. Because then we gotta define, okay, well, you can do accounting here, but you can't do this here. And you gotta
Yeah.
do, you can exchange money here, but you can't do this here. So I think we should just leave that part like it is.
Then item F goes to the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System permit. So I reworded this language to capture that they'll get it when they need it. And I was incorrect about it being more limited to open dumps. I think most of these are going to trigger the need for a permit. There'll be some perhaps, but I just don't know the nature of every operation that would not need it, but then the onus is gonna be on the applicant to say, you know, this is my operation, this is proof that I don't need the NPDES permit, otherwise they're gonna have it. Item G, that was just cleanup language consistent with what we talked about, identifying the fire code appropriately, and then including in there the handling, storage, and disposal of hazardous wastes. We talked about the hazardous waste, we talked about batteries, so I didn't take a stab at trying to outlaw batteries or lithium-ion batteries or any kind of electric vehicle batteries, rather just did the, hey, you will comply with hazardous waste laws. Generally, those batteries are gonna fall with, the components of those batteries are gonna fall within the hazardous waste law, are gonna fall within the universal waste handling requirements, which don't allow permanent disposal and keeping on the property, but that's not something that the county has jurisdiction over. That's something that the state has and exercises through DHEC. Once I dug into it, I was kind of surprised that I thought the legislation and the regulation would have been at a more mature level. It really isn't. It's not as far along as you would think, and it's going to hit. It's going to hit in a big way with all the vehicles that are out there now. But it is catching up, and there are recycling programs. There's a couple of very large nationwide recycling programs for the batteries, but I think at this point, compliance with the DHEC requirements and it fits within the universal waste standards is the route to go. If y'all want to get the county on an enterprise of, one, I don't believe we can't ban the disposal or handling or recycling of lithium ion or other similar nickel carbide or whatever the kind of batteries are in a county completely. Generally, if it's a lawful operation, you can zone it, you can put it in certain limited areas within the county, but you can't give it a complete ban in the county. So I think at this point, it's good to have, you will comply with the hazardous waste laws that covers that issue, concerned about, people just storing batteries for a couple of years and explosions or what have you. But if you want to tackle it in a bigger way, I think it's probably left for another day in a different ordinance.
Just some fuel for thought, when it comes to manufacturers' instructions, I also think of other words like guidelines and recommendations. I don't know if you can get that wording in there, but someone could say, well, the manufacturer didn't give me any instructions. But there's also these guidelines or something. So anyway, I'm just throwing it out for your consideration.
It's a good point, and the industry standards, again, that's a kind of a term of art in the construction industry, that you will have this be the standard, because essentially, not saying the way that everybody does it is always the right way, but this is the way, following guidelines, following common practice, this is the way that this practice has evolved, and this is the industry standard, and you will follow that. So if you don't have a manufacturer's guidelines or manufacturer's instructions, which usually, run hand in hand with the industry standards. If you don't have one, the industry standard is the default, and that could be manifested in a guideline or something of that nature. So, but I think if we go too far afield with other terms, guidelines, or terms of similar nature, then you give the applicant or whomever too much ambiguity, or things to select from that they're gonna follow.
Point well taken, thank you.
So I started working with which was section 5 before, the non-conforming or the grandfathered junkyards, and I did not, kind of toss my hat in, or throw the towel in rather, but I did, because we got to that point last time in the conversation, that, we had been here for a while when we talked about it. I didn't feel like we got to the point where we really knew what we wanted to do with the existing ones. So that's why I started rewriting it. And then I said, this whole section needs further discussion in total. Because after watching the video, I think it does. So I don't know what y'all want to do with it, with the existing ones. If you want to leave them be, if you want to have them do something within a year, if that is, if they are to do something, what you want that to be. If you want to let them be, and then if they expand, then the whole section 4 or 574 is triggered, and how much expansion would be necessary. I noted, Mr. Pearson, you asked me about the section 38 grandfathering language, and when that, they lose that grandfather protection, what percentage? It was 50% for buildings. But there's some more broad language in there too. If it's altered, rebuilt, or what have you, then you could lose your grandfathered status. So really, I just need to get an idea of what you want to do with it. Do you want to leave these folks who are
Personally, I think
operating alone?
that expansion trigger is a good thing, because I do like the idea of things being able to be grandfathered. At the same time, this whole thing has come about because of safety.
Right.
So what does that mean to us?
If you grandfather somebody, are they exempt from the fire code reg and the NPDES permit?
Well, it would depend on the nature of the new operations, that they're seeking and what they're doing. So I don't think they're gonna be exempt from an NPDES permit if they're doing something that requires one now. But, I guess the other parts are within your province to decide. If you're talking about the safety, you're talking about the attractive nuisance safety issue, having it fenced off from children or folks like that,
I mean, that was one of the big reasons we determined to tackle this, is because of children coming in or this or that. And expansion could most definitely do that. At the same time, if somebody's been running something for 20 years without incident, who are we to say that they now have to do something to prevent an incident?
If I recall correctly that, I printed it up.
The surroundings.
Yeah, but we don't have too much government overreach on that.
What if when they started the business, there was no neighborhood, and now there's a
And now there is.
subdivision?
And now
there
again, it
is.
goes back to that safety issue.
Right, so,
This is the most impactful piece of this whole thing.
Oh, yeah. This is the
elephant in the room.
right.
Right, so the state provision on how they do it within the Junkyard Control Act. So any junkyard lawfully in existence on March 24th of 1966, which is within 1,000 feet, and that's their setback area, of the edge of the right-of-way and visible from the main traveled way of any highway or interstate, and any junkyard lawfully in existence along the highway, which may hereafter be designated as an interstate or federal aid primary highway, and does not conform to the requirements of that section, so it's grandfathered in, what we're talking about, shall be screened if feasible by the department, that's the Department of Transportation, at locations on the highway right-of-way or in areas acquired for such purposes outside of the right-of-way so as not to be visible from the main traveled way of such highways. So the DOT has said in that instance, so as not to put a burden on these existing operations, is we are going to, within our property area, the right-of-way, the state right-of-way, we will screen it in the way we see fit. So that's the way that the state has gone about tackling it. I'm not trying to put the county's tax dollars up there for y'all to do. I'm just reading out the way that the way the state has approached it.
We don't hold existing commercial junkyards to some standards. You know, what we're saying is, oh, since you're already here, we don't really worry about your safety. You know, we're not concerned, which I am. I'm concerned about the safety. And so, you know, I think we need to have, you know, maybe some period of time that they have to get ready for this, but that they would have to conform.
I kind of agree with that. I feel like the idea of tackling this kind of an ordinance to this business is because of what the existing junkyards are doing.
So have we ever had a safety incident in a junkyard from some outsider?
You'd have to ask the
I would
police.
say yes. Seems to reason that it would be.
I don't know, I guess you'd have to ask the police for
Having
incident
a record
reports
of it.
or hospital. I mean, I don't know.
So I do know from just doing some insurance defense litigation throughout the years, that there's sound case law on the books for attractive nuisances, that even if the parent is negligent, lets their child wander on to a place like this and the child gets hurt, they're gonna have a clear right of action against the owner of the junkyard operation, regardless of what you all do here. So I'm not saying just forget about the existing ones, I'm just saying that there is a civil remedy for attractive nuisances on the books, because I've had to defend places that had an attractive nuisance, and it's a difficult defense to do. That's just information for y'all to consider.
And a junkyard is defined as an attractive nuisance? Is that what you're saying?
If you were a 5 or 7 year old boy or girl and
I mean,
wanting to
legally,
play, you're like, this looks great.
No, I know, but
I
legally.
mean, that's generally the test. I mean, it's just gotta be something that is dangerous, the nuisance part, and it looks fun.
So using Ms. Spicer's example of a developer moves in, he builds a bunch of homes next to an existing junkyard. It's not the developer's responsibility to fence his development off, it's the junkyard's liability if somebody from that neighborhood wanders over.
Yeah, I think you're gonna have, there's no right to junkyard act, like a right to farm act in that situation. So obviously, there's gonna be a negligence standard, what's a reasonable person gonna do in that situation? And if I were operating a junkyard, so just assume I'm a reasonable person, and this development comes in next door, I'm going to do something to ensure that these kids who are playing next door don't wander across the
come onto
street
my
and get
property.
themselves hurt on my property.
So my first thought is we put it in and then let the county come and argue it with county council back out to find out how much pushback there might be. They may already protect themselves. I would, if I had a junkyard, probably already protect myself, so I wouldn't care. But maybe we let it come to the public and let the public push back on, hey, I don't have that problem. I hadn't had a problem in 20 years. Why are you putting this burden on me? At the same time, my fear by putting it in there, from a legal standpoint, is we've just put the nail in the coffin as far as if somebody did get hurt at that point, because we've said you gotta have it. And he goes, man, I was working on putting it in. I put in 200 feet. I got 400 more feet to go, and somebody got hurt.
So I've already made a motion once that we remove this section with the exception of the expansion clause. So I don't think I can make that motion again.
You can't because you don't want to, or you can't because it's
I don't
not.
think I'm allowed to.
And you're saying with the
I can't.
expansion, it triggers this.
Yeah, I think
My motion, my original motion, back when we threw this thing out to start with, was let's strike this section with the exception of an expansion clause that would trigger the full requirements in the section above it, section 4. And so I think I want to make that motion again.
I'll second that.
All right, discussion.
So here's my thought. You've got a guy who's got 100 acres. He's got a small, tiny junkyard that nobody can see, that they are traipsing 400 feet onto his property through trees, through electric fence, whatever, or something, cattle guard or whatever to get in there. And you're about to make him put up $20,000 worth of chain link fence because through the woods on the other side of the creek is somebody that might come onto the property. And that's a hardship on that guy when he's never had an incident, nobody's ever come on his property. But if he expands, if you want to grow that thing, then yeah, you're going to have to follow these rules and put up that $20,000 fence. That's kind of where I'd lean.
Or,
So,
here's an example of a junkyard, say, and it's got so much junk, it's spilling into the roadways now.
there are those cases.
And there are those cases, it's not fenced. And using county resources to answer emergency calls. And we went through
Put out
this
fires, I
with
think.
fire, right? 6 times in X number of months. And that was when we were talking about the permitting and the licensing. You know, here's a business that's using fire frequently and has no skin in the game in terms of even paying for a permit. That was kind of the discussion there, but that's why I'm thinking, this existing junkyard is already using fire department regularly, spilling into the roadways, and he's gonna be exempt from this unless he expands. Well, there's no room to expand, maybe, but
How about we add to the expansion clause, change of ownership?
Okay, that wasn't where I was thinking you were going. I don't know if we can, but
that matters.
yeah, change of ownership probably should be added as well. I was wondering, is there any way, and I don't know that you could do it without really causing a problem, but safety calls or public service calls, you just trigger
A conforming
a conformance
condition
clause.
or whatever. Maybe
Is there
that's
any
it.
way to do that easily?
How do you do that?
I'm assuming you can, but.
And we could come up with something not easily tracked. So the Tort Claims Act is gonna protect the county in the instance you're talking about. When you have a legislative action, that something may cascade and a problem happen. So we're gonna be shielded from liability for legislative action or inaction. But once we get into exercising this discretion within an ordinance that's out there, then that's when I, start losing
We put
sleep.
ourselves in a position. So it's kind of an all or nothing.
Ish, yeah.
And maybe that example is real life.
Yeah, I mean, you look at that and you go, well, why not? You know? But then your example was hidden and all that. That's different.
I mean, I understand the frustration. There's gonna be a lot of people that say, well, this ordinance has no bite. It doesn't apply to anybody right now. And that's true, it will not. But it is a start.
And had we had it 20 years ago, so today's better than
And,
never.
once things start changing ownership or expanding, then, you've got your regulation in place. I mean, that's the positive aspect of it. And people, there's some predictability to it.
I'm a coin toss at the moment. I'm almost to the put it in and then let it be argued back out, because I don't truly know how many people are out there that are existing junkyards. Again, if I had an existing junkyard, I'm gonna measure how close are my neighbors, how much intrusion is there, and if I'm in the middle of nowhere, I'm gonna come argue. I'm in the middle of nowhere.
Well, then you can get BZA, if we say, we don't grandfather anybody, couldn't somebody go to the BZA and get an exception and say, I think I should be exempt from this and argue the case? Is that possible?
You could set it up that way, yeah. set it up as a special exception process.
I'm already hidden, to your point, I'm hidden in the woods, I've already accommodated this. Shouldn't have
I've got a
happened.
creek and two rivers between me. I mean, they've got to swim a river and go through all this to get to me. Why are you making me to put up a chain link fence?
Right, so he could plead his case and probably win, right?
Never know. You never know.
I just hate having to go in front of a six-member board, though, that, to plead a case like that.
Okay.
This is a tough one.
Um,
I might like to revisit this part again.
Oh,
We have a motion and a second on the floor.
I'll repeat the motion, please. What is
A
it?
motion was to strike this section with the exception of a clause that includes an expansion clause or a change of ownership clause that would trigger compliance with Section 4, the full requirements.
Okay. Any further discussion? All those in favor?
I'll write it. I'll write that in there and you'll have another bite at the apple. So if you decide after you see,
Well,
you're like,
that-
this is not what we
Yeah,
want.
I would like to revisit this one again.
Well, this is not a final. We're gonna get it and look at it one more time before it's even sent up, so if we have to change it, we can.
And I'll just be honest with you, I know at least one conservative on council that's not gonna like us not affecting the existing junkyards. There's a good example of where there is at least one with junk spilling out right at the side of the road. It's a major thoroughfare, so it's not that I condone that, it's just the practicality of trying to legislate something reasonable at the moment.
But we also cannot pick one individual
That's
business
correct.
and do an ordinance because of what he's doing. It has to be in general.
That's
for
my
what
other
is
concern, is it needs to
happening.
be generic.
So,
If we do, y'all have an example of, and know of, just as a citizen, of a property that has junk, has any kind of material spilling into a roadway area, and pass along to James, because that's something we can do something about now. That's either states or the county's roadway, right-of-way for a purpose, which is for travel. So if that's being impeded by some means in that easement area, then we can get it cleaned up.
So if there's some impeding, is there the ability to put teeth under that? If the county is called out X number of times for a violation, that it could then trigger some of this? And then we're not saying fire or safety or this or that. We're saying if the county has been called out for a true violation of some other ordinance, that this can be triggered after the second occurrence or something like that. To give teeth to the other part.
That sounds too punitive to me.
That's too what?
Sounds too punitive to me. I don't think you should tie those two things together.
I'm gonna write it the way the motion passed, and if y'all wanna add it, I mean, it can be written that way, yeah, it'd be difficult perhaps to track, perhaps not, could be punitive, I don't know, but it could be effective, so y'all just think about it this way, you're the policy makers. First step in the policy making process.
Advisors.
There you go. And so then the last one was 756, provisions for administration, really enforcement. Well, the application process I didn't tinker with. The main thing I tinkered with was the penalties. And so I just, all of that was good. That's the way that uniform ordinance, all the language that I struck down at the bottom, yeah, that's the way the uniform ordinance summons are generally written. But just using our default language that, violation of a county ordinance is subject to the full jurisdiction of the magistrate's court. It's $500, 30 days at this point, but that can change. Alternatively, we can seek conjunctive relief through a civil, pursuit, which is probably gonna be something that the county's more inclined to do, because we don't want to necessarily use a criminal enforcement procedure against folks in this setting. So that was just a simplification.
You've done a wonderful job.
Thanks. Quicker job tonight than last time. All right, so I'll get it back to y'all. Clean version. We can work on that grandfathering provision some more.
If
Thank you.
there's no further business,
Move we adjourn.
all those in favor?
Aye.